Now, let's talk about a very interesting topic. This is the unit 2 of the PSIR syllabus. After we are done with this, then I'll move to unit 1 and then only some of the remaining parts are left here. Now, see, theories of state. In your syllabus, what is mentioned, first I'll write that. So, it is written theories of state, and then there is a mention of the liberal theory of state. All of this is in the syllabus. Neoliberal theory of state. By now, you have some good idea. What is the liberal theory? What is the neoliberal theory? Okay. Marxist theory of state, this you know. Now, there's a mention of pluralist theory. This you don't know right now. Okay. These 4 are mentioned, and other than that, there are 2 more. Separate post-colonial theory, and then there is feminist theory of state. Feminist theory of state, right? All this is directly mentioned in our syllabus, okay? That what all should we be reading and what should all we be writing, this is directly mentioned here for us, right? Now, before I move to each of the theory, I first have to again go back to what is a state. Why are we studying about state here in this particular part, right? And after we are done with this, then I'll come to these specific parts, fine? So, first, let us break down the very topic itself. The topic says to us theories of state, fine? Now, first thing. Now, it is said by a lot of thinkers that political science, the entire study of political science or political science in general is about the study of state, right? And when a statement like this is made, you can also understand what they are trying to say. That political science, you know, it's a very deep, very vast discipline. But if you understand what is the state, the study of state is nothing but the study of political science. So the state has a very important importance, or it is a very important entity when we talk about political science. Okay, first, which is why today in this first part of the lecture of theories of state, I will first tell you about the origins of the state. I will tell you about the evolution of state from the ancient times to the modern times. How has the state evolved? All this becomes very important for us, right? And then we'll see what are the important elements of a state. In your polity, in fact, in one of my previous classes, I did tell you state is comprised of 4 elements. So there was a Montevideo Convention of 1933. In that, it was said state has 4 things. Okay, so, and I'm mentioning this Montevideo Convention of 1933, which means the 4 elements of state are relatively new. Okay, so state comprises of, some of you may know this, for some of you it may be new. By the way, this same concept you will again do in your GS polity also. This is something, and this has been asked by UPSC in prelims also. Territory, population, government, and also sovereignty. Very important, right? All these 4 happen to be very important. But I'm putting a specific star mark on sovereignty because in today's lecture, I will also be talking to you about what ultimately is sovereignty. Okay, so we will be talking about all these elements one by one. Okay, so that is one. Now, what is a state? State comprises of territory, population, so government and sovereignty, right? Now, we will be seeing this and examining this in more detail. It is a part of Montevideo Convention, right? But you already know Montevideo Convention is relatively modern in the sense 1933, not even 100 years have passed. Okay, which brings us to 2 specific questions on state. Okay, that one is, let's say, if I say how has the state evolved, which means evolution of state. So from ancient times to modern times, etc., how has it evolved? How has the concept evolved? Okay, so first I'll tell you about this. Okay, and then I'll go into more specific things. Origin. By the way, when I do these things, many things through Western thinkers, Western political thought, IPT even, we have seen it. So this for you is going to be a very good revision of all that we have seen, right? For example, if you try to recall, Hegel said state is the march of God on earth, right? Aristotle said anybody who can live without a state is either a beast or a god, right? If you recall, what did Plato say? Again, for Plato, state is an instrument of virtue. So we have seen over a period of time, there is a huge difference in the evolution of state. Fine, this is there. Now, one by one, I'll tell you. If I talk to you about ancient Greece, right? Now, with respect to ancient Greece, few things you have to remember. The state was imagined to be polis. For Aristotle, the state was polis, right? And this polis was also ethical in nature. It was also virtue based, if you can recall. So in ancient Greece, when we see, right, and if I let's say link it to Aristotle, and you can also say a similar view of Plato, what did Aristotle say? The purpose, yeah, state's function, your purpose, your role, and you think of purpose, recall I did tell you about teleology, okay? State's purpose, again, is to promote what? Good life, right? What did Aristotle say? Sorry, Aristotle we've seen. Think of Plato. Plato said state is individual writ large. This also we saw. So we are very clear what exactly happened, at least in ancient Greece. What was the main idea? Okay. Now, we will now see a distortion. In medieval times, first thing you know, especially the kind of distortion that had happened. Okay. Now, was state totally sovereign? No. In many cases, we will see the religion dominating, right? The religion was dominating in many cases. Second, we had seen emergence of, let's say, divine rights theory. King was the embodiment of the king was embodiment of the divine. So people had to obey the king because they were in that sense obeying the god. Things like this had come. So the role of the state here is going to transform, especially in the medieval times. Okay. What I can say, that state is tied to kingship, and I'm writing DRT. DRT here is divine rights theory. So there is a change in the nature of state. In fact, you know, especially here, just in this time, okay, so that is why we say Machiavelli had come, and Machiavelli talked about how state should be separate from the religion. He talked about how there should be separation between ethics and politics, right? All of that, right? So that is something we have seen. So we are sure about what has happened in the medieval times. Now, here, third thing I can also write, the social contract tradition as seen in the works of Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau. Whenever I will talk about social contract, please remember, pre-state, before state, we are talking of something known as state of nature. And we have seen how for Hobbes, in state of nature, life is nasty, poor, brutish, solitary, short. Okay. But for Locke, because Locke has an enlightened view of human nature, it is better, right? It is more positive in nature. So we have seen what Hobbes is to say, what we have seen what Locke wants to say, and both of them, and in fact even Rousseau, they will say that state, so there is a social contract which ties the people and the state, right? People and the state are tied together by a social contract. That social contract becomes very important, right? So there is ancient times, medieval times, social contract tradition, there is pre-state, there is a state of nature overall, and this is what we talk about, right? Now, so this is one. Next, we can go into the modern times, okay? Now, in modern times, what do we know? Again, let's say Max Weber would come, okay, and basically for Max Weber, state will have the legitimacy, okay, to use force. In fact, he would say the monopoly on violence is to be exercised only by the state. So in the modern times, what we are seeing, the role of the state becoming more powerful. It is the state that is the most important entity, right? Through the works of Max Weber and even beyond, we see the increasing role of state that is going to come, and this is what is getting highlighted, okay? So modern, your Max Weber state hai, that there is a monopoly, okay, that the legitimate use of force is to be done only by the state. That is the main point that we say, okay? Till here, most of us are clear. However, we should also know that in the modern times, I can still talk about one or couple of more examples, which will be fifth, right? So first, see the examples. Think of EU, European Union. EU becomes what? Supranational, right? Big entity. So now, when we see European Union, all the countries, they have something known as an important concept, pooled sovereignty. And now also think, what was the earlier concept? That state was sovereign in its sphere. Now, by the way, the people in EU, if they have, let's say, if overall they are part of EU in general, you know something known as Schengen. Okay, Schengen arrangement, etc. So here, the people are free to move in these respective spheres, right? That also becomes a very important point. So here, when I'm saying of pooled sovereignty, this is a departure from the existing modern notion of state, okay? Supranational entities are rising, okay? In fact, if you think of the rise of neoliberalism, here, so EU, the rise of EU says the concept of state is declining. The rise of neoliberalism will say the concept of state is declining. Q, markets again have to become fundamental. Think of 70s and 80s, Margaret Thatcher, etc. What happened here? Reaganomics, Thatcheronomics, it again highlighted how this becomes a very important entity, right? So what is the takeaway and what is the understanding for us here? That state was very powerful in the modern sense, but with time, again the state got diluted, which means the rise of entities like EU, blocks like EU will mean the concept of state will go down. With neoliberalism, the state will become less powerful. So I'll write two specific ways. I'm writing that state is declining. How do I see this? So one, for example, let's say rise of EU, okay, and other blocks. Second, I can say because of globalization. Now in globalization, see, globalization fundamentally is what? According to Anthony Giddens, it is the compression of time and space. Ab globalization mein your borders, etc., will not remain a fundamental entity. The borders, the concept, because now people, ideas, everything, capital can move easily between borders. So there is globalization, okay? Then, so EU hai, globalization hai, and then there is also, we see the rise of, let's say, neoliberalism, wherein you see the rise of market fundamentalism. This will again say roll back the state. The state should not be that prominent. This was seen. But we still have a counter to this. We again see the role of state is increasing. I still have examples for this. How? 2008 global financial crisis. What did it say? That over-reliance on neoliberalism has challenges. The role of state is equally important. One. Now, 2016 onwards, okay, the year is not that important for you, but there are trends. 2016 onward, in fact, what we saw, for example, Trump had come to power. So Trump will talk about, although in Trump 2.0, we say MAGA, making America great again, but previously also, Trump was what? He was very anti-immigrant. The same thing was seen around EU, in some of the EU countries, be it Germany, be it France and some other countries. There is the rise of far right parties. These parties are anti-globalization, anti-immigration. What this will mean? Anti-globalization, anti-immigration. Again, they will say state is more important. There will be rise of xenophobia. Xeno means outsider, fear of outsider. Right? Again, think of COVID-19. Again, state becoming more important. And also think of terrorism, the global issues, where again the states and its role becoming even more important. So right now the state, which was initially seen to be declining, has again become equally important. And by the way, these all examples which we are seeing here, I will be again repeating in paper 2A because these are more relevant from paper 2A. But please remember, any discussion on state should include the modern dimension as well. This is where you will connect. Yes, sir, this is what we are seeing even right now. Right? So what we are seeing is state here over is declining. How state is increasing. And this for you is the overall understanding of state. Fine? How the state or the concept of state has evolved over a period of time here is in front of you. So that becomes a very important entity and a very important concept in this particular case, right? So this is one. Okay. So this is one. So what we have seen first is in political science, the role of state is very important. That is why it is said political science is nothing but the study of state. Okay. Second is the evolution of state that you have seen. Okay. That from ancient times to medieval times to modern times, social contract tradition, etc. How has state evolved? Third thing which we have just done previously is the criteria related to state, Montevideo Convention. This we have done, the 4 entities. So I'm not going to repeat again this, right? This we have seen. When I'll give you write-up, I will be including all these points, so you will get a fair idea, right? Criteria we have done, but now a very important part is also related to the origin, okay, of state. Find that how ultimately state as an entity has evolved. And with origin, I'll also come, in fact, what I will do, because see, when I say origin, I'll go into the mechanistic theory, etc. That is more tied to liberal notion. Let me first take sovereignty because this is directly tied to this idea. Fine. 4 elements of a state, one of the elements is sovereignty. First, let me take up sovereignty and then I'll come to origin of state. Fine. That is also equally important. And in origin, just for your reference, in case some of you are wanting to know, we'll redo it, but just remember, for some, the state is natural or organic. It's a very natural, very organic entity. But for others, it is purely a mechanical entity. It has been created. So there are 2 diverging views on how the state has come into being. Origin is debated. Right? Now, let's take this keyword, very interesting keyword for us. We are talking of sovereignty. Okay. So what is sovereignty here? One by one, let's have a look at. So number one thing is, see, sovereignty, when I say sovereignty is that one is independent. Very simple word, right? If you think of Indian preamble, we say that India is a sovereign, secular, socialist, democratic republic. All these values are mentioned in the preamble. Sovereign is also mentioned, which means India is independent, and India in general is independent both in taking its internal decisions and even in the external part. So that means that in that sense, state is going to be the most independent entity, and state is ultimately responsible for the welfare of its citizens. So nobody can give instructions or make very specific binding commitments on that state. Because what is a state? State where one of the elements will always be, it is sovereign entity. So in the external affairs and even in the internal affairs, it is going to be independent in its decision making. Please understand this, right? Now, in sovereignty, please remember, there are certain theories of sovereignty. Now, the most dominant theory happens to be the monistic theory of sovereignty, which is nothing but almost kind of a legal theory of sovereignty. Okay. So in the works of Austin, Bodin, we see monistic or legal theory of sovereignty. Okay. So here, what do they say? Simple. Monistic means what? Single, one. A very simple thing they point out is that state is the ultimate sovereign. Right? All the power lies with the state, and they are very clear about it. Okay? So through the work of Jane Austen, etc., Jean Bodin, what they say, monistic theory means that sovereignty, all the power, everything lies only with the state. State is the absolute sovereign. And when you read this, your mind can also go back to Hobbes. Hobbes used to say the same thing also. Law is the command of the sovereign, right? And Hobbes did not want to share any of these powers. Same, in fact, even Machiavelli did not want to share any of these powers. So state was the absolute supreme power. That is one of the core works of this. Okay, so monistic theory, one absolute sovereign. So be it even Hobbes also says the same thing. Austin also says the same thing. So absolute power lies with the state. Very clear they are on what this is going to be about, right? So fun thing is this, monistic theory. Now, there will be a counter, of course. Now, the counter is by a pluralistic theory. Pluralistic theory. Now, what does the pluralistic theory say? So here there are people like Lasky, there are people like McIver. Okay. The idea of this theory is, just see the name. Monistic is what? Single. So in pluralistic, what they say, state, while is very important, but can state do all the functions? What about church? What about, let's say, educational institutions, different institutions? So what they say, man has multiple needs. State cannot meet all the needs of a man. Okay. So that means to say that all the power, all the utility, all the importance only lies with the state. It may not be most accurate and most correct. That is their core point. So the pluralists, what they want to say is that sole responsibility should not be given to the state. Right? One. Another argument also happens that if you give too much of power to the state, monopoly of power, think of one quote by Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So pluralists, what they say, if you give all the power, everything to the state in the external domain, internal domain, what would happen? There can always be a chance of, first of all, they say that thinking that all the power is with the state is nothing but a legal fiction, because there are other entities who also perform an important function. Second, if all the power is with the state, so the state can become totalitarian. This can also be a challenge, right? So what about the individual people rights? Whereas if a state is controlled, some power is with the state, important power is with the state, but other powers also are there with other entities. So in that sense, power becomes diffused. There will not be concentration of power. That happens to be the core argument that they want to highlight. So the main thing that they are highlighting, the pluralist theory, is that all the power with the state, this notion is problematic. It is also dangerous. That is how you have to understand. So whenever there is a discussion on these two aspects, which means when I'm talking of sovereignty, you will have to talk about and think about pluralism also, and you will also think about the other part, which means the monistic theory. And by the way, when we do the concept and theory of power, we will again see same thing. In power also, there is again a view, elitist theory of power. The power only lies with the elites. And then there is a view of pluralist theory of power. The same concept will again get repeated. In pluralist theory of power, the idea is many other entities also have power. So it is not that the state has the ultimate power with itself. So this also happens to be again a case in point which we can definitely think about. Okay, so now what we will do, all the things that you've written, just first write the heading of theories of state, a couple of lines we will write, and then we also move back to evolution part of it. Okay, write theories of state. Theories of state. So write according to Raymond G. Gettel, right, put a dash, right, of all social institutions, comma, the state has been the most universal of all the social institutions. The state has been the most universal and the most powerful. State has been the most universal and the most powerful. And political science is essentially the science of the state. ये जो term है, the science of the state, you can put that in inverted commas. And political science is essentially it is essentially the science of the state. It is essentially the science of the state. Full stop, right? The state is not a divine gift. State is not a divine gift or the deliberate invention of a single moment. Rather, Gettel argues that it is a gradual historical evolution, whose beginnings lie deep in the past. Gradual, historical evolution, whose beginnings lie deep in the past. Okay, full stop. Now change the paragraph. Write the mini heading, evolution of state. Right, in case you have made running notes, excellent, but still I'll give you one paragraph combining all of this so that you remember. The heading is Evolution of the State. Okay, so here please write, the concept of the state has evolved. The concept of the state has evolved across history. The concept of the state has evolved across history, dash, beginning with the ancient Greek idea of the polis. Greek idea of the polis as a natural, Greek idea of the polis as a natural and ethical, community, aimed at the attainment of the good life, good life, full stop, right? In medieval Europe, the state came to be associated with kingship. In medieval Europe, the state came to be associated with kingship and the doctrine of divine right. Full stop, right? With the rise of social contract tradition, these are all keywords for us. With the rise of social contract tradition, thinkers such as Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, presented a mechanistic and secular view of the state. They presented a mechanistic and a secular view of the state. Underline mechanistic. This term I will again explain to you when I will do origin of the state. Organic view, mechanistic view, etc. This also we will see. ठीक है? Presented a mechanistic and a secular view of the state as the creation of individual consent, to secure rights and maintain order. Full stop, right? In the modern times, Max Weber, we've already done it in one of the previous, if you remember, power, authority, legitimacy, वहाँ पे भी देखा है हमने. There also we've seen Max Weber, right? In the modern times, Max Weber defined the state as the institution. It defined the state as the institution that possesses a monopoly over the legitimate use over the legitimate use. It possesses the monopoly over the legitimate use of physical force of physical force within a given territory. Physical force within a given territory. Within a given territory. Territory, full stop. Then write post-World War II developments. Post-World War II developments led to the rise of supranational institutions. Led to the rise of supranational institutions like the EU, that is European Union, like the EU, European Union. In fact, when we do in paper 2A, we'll do European Union in a lot of detail. Just for your reference, I'll tell you, think of the World War, right? The First World War, Second World War. There were so many, within Europe only, many countries were fighting amongst themselves, right? Which means, for example, the Allies power, the Axis powers, they were fighting, right? And just after World War, just after, let's say, the World War ended, the creation of UN happened, and of course, EU happened. Yet, despite so much of bloodshed, these countries could come together. They had pooled sovereignty, right? So many times this question can also be there, that do you expect in South Asia, right? In South Asia, there have been a lot of wars for liberation, etc. that have been there. And SAARC has been the most, or I should not most, it is the least integrated region of the world, South Asian region. This is by a World Bank report. The name of the report was a World Bank ki, the glass half full. In that report, it had mentioned that South Asia, and that is something known as SAFTA overall, South Asia Free Trade Agreement overall, the overall region, is the least integrated region of the world. Right now, we know why SAARC is not functioning, because of the relationship between India and Pakistan. The stalemate since 2016. Okay. But the point that you now need to remember is that if EU can function, the states can come together, at least theoretically even we can say, there can be a scope for better cooperation maybe in the coming years for South Asia. Okay, so just a point I am telling you. So now you can again continue. Post-World War II developments led to the rise of supranational institutions like the EU, though events like the 2008 financial crisis, and Brexit marked a return. Like Brexit, it marked a return it marked a return to the assertive nation state. It marked a return to the assertive nation state. Return to the assertive nation state. Okay, now next paragraph, a short note on the Montevideo Convention. I'll tell you all the 4 elements, and then we will jump to the comparison of monistic and pluralistic sovereignty. Now, monistic and pluralistic has been asked by UPSC many times in the exam. So we'll also do it in some detail, that what is monistic, what is pluralistic, why is, let's say, monistic not desirable for the pluralists, what are the core arguments, that we'll have a look at. Fine. So now write the Montevideo Convention, bracket 1933. Laid down the 4 accepted criteria of statehood. It laid down the 4 accepted criteria of statehood. Put a dash and write permanent population. There is a permanent population, comma, a defined territory. Permanent population, a defined territory, comma, a government government okay, and the capacity. So we have seen population, territory, and government, and right, and the capacity to enter relations, and a capacity to enter into relations, capacity to enter into relations with other states, a capacity to enter into relations with other states, full stop. Full stop, right? Of these comma sovereignty is the most essential. Of these, sovereignty is the most essential element. Sovereignty is the most essential element crystallized after the Treaty of Westphalia. Crystallized after the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. Crystallized after the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. Crystallized after the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. Full stop, right? Classical theorists like Jean Bodin and in your margins also write Treaty of Westphalia. Treaty of Westphalia is something very fundamental in paper 2A. We will again refer it many a times. Okay, so if you want, you can just write it in your margins also. Is going to be something, and very many times in the newspaper also. Sometimes they will write Westphalian states. So there is a mention of this because the theory of sovereignty ultimately is going to be an outcome of this. Treaty of Westphalia 1648. Okay, which also tells you these are relatively modern concepts. These are not very old concepts. Okay. So what I was saying, so you can write classical theorists like Jean Bodin defined sovereignty as supreme and unrestrained power, while Grotius emphasized that the sovereign's acts cannot be overridden. The sovereign's acts cannot be overridden by any superior authority. By any superior authority. By any superior authority. Okay, now write a mini heading. The mini heading is monistic versus the pluralistic theory of sovereignty. So we'll do both. I've given you a basic idea. Monistic theory, ultimately talking about ultimately state is the legal sovereign. All the powers should lie with the state, and we'll see the justification of this theory in the works of both even Hobbes, even Austin, even just now we saw Jean Bodin and the theory of sovereignty. So first we'll see monistic theory and then we'll see pluralistic theory. Okay, so write monistic versus pluralistic theory of sovereignty. In the margins also write, जहाँ pluralist theory है ना, right? Pluralist theory of power. Okay. So when in fact we've already covered the power, तो वहाँ पे हमने देखा भी हुआ है इसको, right? So now write monistic theory में, please write, under the monistic theory of sovereignty, under the monistic theory of sovereignty, right? Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, and John Austin, thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and John Austin asserted that sovereignty is absolute, comma, indivisible. It is absolute, comma, indivisible, and located in a determinate authority. And located in a determinate authority. Located in a determinate authority. Located in a determinate authority. Full stop, right? Hobbes argued in Leviathan. That only an undivided sovereign, Hobbes argued in the Leviathan. We know the name of the book of Hobbes is Leviathan. In Leviathan, that only an undivided sovereign can secure peace. Only an undivided sovereign can secure peace. And Austin's legal positivism, defined law as the command of a sovereign. Law as the command of the 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 sovereign. Which receives habitual obedience. Which receives habitual obedience. Which receives habitual obedience, right? अब देखो जहाँ पे where we've written habitual obedience, again I'm connecting you to one more topic that we've done. We had seen the concept of political obligation. It simply means why should the people obey? For Plato and Aristotle, the people will obey because state is an element of virtue. State exists for good life, right? Whereas for Hobbes, law is the command of the sovereign. It's a command, you have to obey that command, right? That is why you will again recall why Hobbes, in fact even John Austin, will be against something known as natural rights. Locke will talk about natural rights. In fact, even you can recall Bentham saying natural rights are terroristic in their discourse. Right? Why? Natural rights don't have the backing of the law or the state. So for Hobbes or anybody who is talking about legal positivism or anybody who's rooted in the legal theory, law kya hai? Whatever is law is supported by state. Natural rights are not supported by state. Now, what if state creates a law saying natural rights are legal? Then it is going to be fine. But until and unless that is not done, it will be a problem. So when you understand monistic theory, what is monistic theory saying? Anything done by the state, because state is absolute, right? Nobody can question. Law is the command of the sovereign, and because of that, the people should obey the state, right? And you have to remember the context in which this theory has come. The context was Europe was facing chaotic times. To bring in stability, it was thought that state should be given all the power. If the state does not have enough power, stability will also be not there. That is the challenge. Right? That is one. So, you write, this theory was developed during the chaotic medieval conditions. This theory was developed during chaotic chaotic conditions of medieval Europe, or chaotic medieval conditions. Okay. Now, we have not written yet, but write the name of the book of John Austin. Please write the name of the book, right? Book का नाम है Lectures on Jurisprudence. Lectures on Jurisprudence is the name of the book. Lectures on Jurisprudence. Okay. And there's a एक long quote है इनका. उसका meaning that you may know, but I'll just write this entire quote. Okay, it may look slightly complicated in the beginning, but it is not as complicated as it looks. Okay, right? Inverted commas may, or normally please write. Right? If a determinate human superior comma, not in the habit of obedience to a like superior, if a determinate human superior, so I'm just writing some of the keywords here and then I'll explain this to you also. If a determinate human superior, comma, not in the habit of obedience to a like superior, not in the habit of obedience to a like superior, comma, receives habitual obedience. So I will just write it one by one, though this is the first keyword I'm telling you. This is the second one, and for each of them I'll just explain to you what this means. Okay, slightly complicated on the look of it, but actually it's very easy. Okay, receives habitual obedience from the bulk of a given society from the bulk of a given society, receives habitual obedience from a bulk of a given society, right? That determinate superior is sovereign in that society. That determinate superior is sovereign in that society, comma, and that society is a political and independent society. And that, so that is the fourth part. Okay, fourth part क्या हो गया? And that society is independent. That society is independent and political society. Now let's break this down. Okay, देखो, when a determinate human superior, we are talking about the state, ठीक है? Determinate human superior is the state. What did we say? What is the state? State is the supreme. Fine. Now, पहला, determinate human superior, we are talking about the state. State is supreme, right? And state does not have to obey anybody. State सबसे supreme रहेगा. Is not in the habit of obedience to a like superior. So that simply means state does not obey anybody else. State only obeys itself. As simple as that. It is not in the habit of obedience to a like superior. Okay. Now, एक और चीज देखिए. When I'm saying determinate human superior, right? Which means sovereignty must be clearly defined. Who is the sovereign? Is it a king? Is it a dictator? Is it the constitution or the laws? Okay. Who are driving such actions? Determinate human superior. One. Not in the habit of obedience to a like superior. So simply the state does not obey anybody else. State is supreme in its own sense. Fine. It receives habitual obedience from the bulk of the given society. It means, think of state. The people are obeying the state. State is supreme. State does not obey anybody else. And the state has defined authority. That determinate superior is sovereign in that state. Now, if there is an entity which is following other entity also, then it is not sovereign. आप sovereign तभी हैं, you are only sovereign when you are not obeying anybody else. Your rules, your dictums, your things are obeyed by other people. And then only we can say that particular society is independent also, because it is sovereign and political also. Right? That is the core meaning. So here, this is a long statement. इसको just write down what is the meaning here. इसको in one line please write. Okay, one line. And इसमें भी जो 1, 2, 3, 4 है, first write 1, 2, 3, 4. What is the meaning of each of these 1, 2, 3, 4? When you've written your quote, make 1, 2, 3, 4. And last way in one line, what we'll say, what does Austin argue? So write 1. So write, sovereign must be a clearly identifiable authority. Sovereign must be a clearly identifiable authority. Back bracket में you can write king, parliament, dictator, anything. King, parliament, dictator, that is 1. Right? 2 है, the phrase is not in the habit of obedience to a like superior. Right? Not in the habit of obedience to a like superior. इसमें what you will write? Right? Sovereign obeys no other authority. It obeys no other authority. In simple word, it is supreme. It is supreme. Come to third. Receives habitual obedience from the bulk. इसमें लिखिए. Right? So where sovereignty is based on habitual compliance. Sovereignty is based on habitual compliance and not occasional obedience. Whenever they want, on a special occasion, they are obeying. It is a habit that they are obeying. Habitual obedience. Okay, by the way, all this content in this will be handy if you get a direct question on monistic theory. So you have enough statements, phrases, the work of even Leviathan, that is Hobbes, Jane Austen, this you can quote. And when you write this question, contrast it with pluralist theory. If the question is on pluralist theory, contrast it with monistic theory. Okay, that is third. Then write fourth. Right, fourth में, which is that such a society becomes political and independent society, right? A state exists where the state exists wherever such a sovereign relationship exists. A state exists wherever such a sovereign relationship exists. Okay, now overall, what is the essence here, right? Austin argued that sovereignty is absolute. Austin argued that sovereignty is absolute, comma, indivisible. Sovereignty is absolute, comma, indivisible, and located in a specific superior So it is absolute, comma, indivisible, and located in a specific superior who is habitually obeyed and obeys no one else. Okay, obeys no one else. Now, the overall last part that we'll write. Right, the last paragraph for monistic theory, right? Monistic theory of sovereignty. Now, monistic theory of sovereignty ended medieval anarchy. It ended medieval anarchy, comma, strengthened law and order, and provided a stable foundation for capitalism, comma, making monism influential in modern jurisprudence. Making monism influential in modern jurisprudence. Making monism influential in modern jurisprudence. In the modern jurisprudence, okay? Making monism influential in the modern jurisprudence. Now we'll talk about pluralists. Okay. So, right, pluralist theorist, right, however, emerged in the 20th century. They emerged in the 20th century in response to the devastation of world wars, devastation of world wars and the growth of international law. Growth of international law. Now please see, two things happened. See, monistic theory, what is the theory saying? Everything sovereign, state is sovereign, absolutely. Too much of power, what will happen? We saw world wars. Hardly any collaboration with the states. So what would happen? Two things. Two world wars we had seen. And now there's a growth of international law. Now, the growth of international law, at least there will be a call for greater cooperation between the states without diluting their sovereignty. That is ultimately the core objective of pluralists. They want to avoid world wars, right? So too much of power in the hands of state can be detrimental. That is what they will highlight. So, right, pluralists, they emerged in the 20th century in response to the devastation of world wars. In response to the devastation of world wars and the growth of international law, right, they criticized monism as a legal fiction. They criticized monism as a legal fiction. Okay, right, this is because they're saying it is a legal fiction, and we've seen what is sovereignty? Absolute independence in internal and external matters. Pluralists will say this is not true, it is only a fiction. How? Externally there are many conventions, there are many treaties, etc., which also bind the state. So it will be only wishful thinking to think that state is absolute sovereign. And same in the internal matters, there are many pressure groups, there are many parties, etc. So state, while on paper can say we are totally independent, but in reality it is not the case. Fine. So we have written what pluralistic theory calls monistic theory as legal fiction, right? This is because externally state's choice is limited. Externally, the state's choice is limited by other actors, and its relation, state's choice is limited by other actors and its relations with them, and internally sovereignty is limited. Internally, sovereignty is limited by various organizations and associations. Full stop, right? Therefore, the pluralists argue that state is not the sole authority. The pluralists argue that state is not the sole authority. State is not a sole authority. Full stop, right? The state's primary function, therefore, is not command. The state's primary function, therefore, is not command, but the resolution of conflicts, the resolution of social conflicts. Resolution of social conflicts. Full stop, right? The pluralists want to dilute sovereignty of the state. The pluralists want to dilute the sovereignty of the state and suggest giving importance and suggest giving importance to international laws and other institutions. Other laws and institutions. Okay, now I'll tell you about two scholars within pluralism. One is H. Lasky. For our reference, remember H. Lasky is going to be a moderate pluralist. And there will be somebody known as R.M. McIver. Now here he is going to be an extreme pluralist. These will be the two scholars that we will quote and speak about. Okay, so first, right, H. Lasky. Okay, first I'll tell you a couple of important lines about Lasky. So first, right, according to Lasky, monistic theory was responsible for world wars. According to Lasky, monistic theory is responsible for world wars as it disregards the international laws. Monistic theory is responsible for world wars as it disregards international laws. Right? Right? And now there are a couple of statements of his which are in that sense very famous. Okay, so first, right? Right? Lasky लिखेंगे, put a dash and write, it is an impossible misadventure. And if you directly get this quote, you will understand this quote is coming from which particular topic. Okay, the topic would be pluralist theory of state. So, right, it is an impossible misadventure. Impossible misadventure to find and locate the sovereign it is an impossible misadventure to find and locate the sovereign in a federal state. Okay, and because he believes that there are other institutions also which are important, but they're not given the sovereign status. Second, he also believes that monistic theory is responsible for all these wars. In fact, he will go on to the extent saying that from political science, if you remove the concept of sovereignty, it will do more good to political science. Okay, so just write another quote of his, right? Inverted commas say, right? It would be of lasting benefit. It would be of lasting benefit to political science. It would be of lasting benefit to political science if the whole concept of sovereignty is expunged. Expunged means removed. If the whole concept of sovereignty is expunged. Okay, and he will also argue that, for example, state is ultimately a man-made institution, right? It is not a natural institution. It is created by man, and man has also similar other interests and other needs. So why give all the power to state? Why make state the absolute sovereign? You've made the state the absolute sovereign, and because of that, you face world wars. Now, there's no going back. So the only way to improve the conditions is to again take some of the power back, dilute the sovereignty. That is the core idea. And remember, he is a moderate pluralist. So at one hand, when he criticizes the state for being too sovereign in that sense, he will also say state is very important in terms of conflict. Okay, which is why sometimes the pluralist theory of state is sometimes criticized, that there is ambivalence. They criticize the state also, and yet they want the state to do all the benefit. So remember that he is a moderate pluralist. He will try to balance his stand also at the same time. Okay. So here, just now write. So two statements that you've written of Lasky. Now write. Lasky held that since society is federal, Lasky held that since society is federal, see, when he says society is federal, in polity also you read about federal or federalism. What is federalism? It talks about how the power is getting divided. Let's say there's a center and state. There's a division of powers between center and state. In our Indian constitution, you have Article 246, you have the 7th schedule, etc. talking about it. When he says society is federal, it simply means in society has multiple needs, and these multiple needs are met through different institutions. State is not the only institution. So he's saying when society is federal, authority should also be federal. Authority should also be federal. Very important point. If society is federal, authority should also be federal. Society, authority, please make sure you understand both these points. If society is federal, authority should also be federal. Which means, in reality, what is happening, although the society is federal, authority mein, it is only the state which has absolute authority, which creates a challenge. Society is federal, authority is not federal in that case. Right? So here please write. Lasky held that since society is federal, and also underline this. So totally you have to remember 3 of his statements. Okay? That I will again repeat, but isko likh lo. That since society is federal, comma, authority should also be federal. Authority should also be federal, full stop, right? He also stated that political science would benefit. He also stated that political science would benefit if the concept of sovereignty were abandoned. If the concept of sovereignty were abandoned, full stop, right? Yet he acknowledged that state remains the keystone of social architecture. Yet the state remains the keystone of social architecture. State remains the keystone of social architecture, right? Now I'm repeating the 3 statements of Lasky. Number 1, if society is federal, authority should also be federal. I hope you now understand what is the meaning. Second, it is an impossible adventure to find sovereignty. Okay, that one that we've seen. And third, political science will be benefited if sovereignty is removed or expunged out of it, or if the concept is removed from it. 3 statements. And remember, Lasky is what? He's a moderate pluralist. Fine. So we have seen his works. Now change, right? R.M. McIver, right? R.M. McIver, comma, an extremist pluralist. R.M. McIver, comma, an extreme pluralist, comma, treated state as one association. He treated the state as one association among many. Treated the state as one association among many, and articulated the idea of the service state, and articulated the idea of service state. You can put service state in inverted commas, and articulated the idea of service state. देखो, first of all, he's an extreme pluralist, and he will say that there is not one single entity but many. So state is not one association, but it is amongst many associations, number one. And with the service state, he brings a very important concept. He says, a state commands because it serves, right? So it means the states who command authority, when the people obey, people are obeying because those are service states. And if we flip the concept, the contrary part would say the people will stop obeying if the state does not become a service state. So if the state does not provide the service role, if it is not managing conflicts, the people will stop to obey. This is a distinction he makes. Fine. So please understand this. So now please write. Right, MacIver, an extreme pluralist, treated the state as one association among many, and articulated the idea of the service state, arguing that the state commands because it serves. Full stop, right? For him, the state is both the guardian. For him, the state is both the guardian and the child of law. The state is both the guardian and the child of law. Means creates the law also and protects the law also. Guardian and the child of law. Okay, full stop, right? The state cannot exercise. Guardian and child wale pe hi we are writing. The state cannot exercise arbitrary powers. Right, full stop, right? State's purpose is to maintain law and order. State's purpose is to maintain law and order, and at the same time, state is also under the law. At the same time, state is also under the law. Okay, now, many of us know about the concept of general will, again of Rousseau. So what does MacIver say? Isko likho, write down the statement of MacIver. Right? The general will is not the will of the state, but the will of the people. The general will is not the will of the state, but the will of the people. Okay, right? Isko likho. This means that earlier the concept of general will was misunderstood. This means that the concept of general will was earlier misunderstood. It was misunderstood as if the state enjoyed ultimate power. As if the state. So here he makes a distinction. Basically, the distinction is when we say general will, if the state is implementing the general will. It is not the will of the state, it is the will of the people. So state cannot be arbitrary. So if you notice Lasky as well as McIver, their main idea is to reduce sovereignty of the state and also reduce the discretion, reduce the kind of, let's say, distortion of powers. So ultimately, idea is to reduce the sovereignty, reduce the arbitrariness. Fine. So right, it is the idea was misunderstood as if the state enjoys ultimate powers. Full stop, right? It is people's wish. It is people's wish which is expressed through the general will. It is the people's wish that is expressed through the general will. It is the people's wish that is expressed through the general will. Full stop, right? State itself has to abide by the will of the people. State itself has to abide by the will of the people. Okay. Now the last heading, right? Assessment. Here I'll also show a certain criticism that this theory faces, as well as what is the overall way forward, right? Assessment. Ab dekho, assessment, if you want to understand, you will also see the fundamental difference. The difference is what kind of power you want to give, right? If you give lesser powers to the state, what will happen in the times of conflict, right? Because in the times of conflict, you want the state to become important. For example, if McIver says that state is one amongst many associations, fine, and you've diluted sovereignty of the state, what if there's a time of crisis? Now many institutions will say we are more important, our power should not be stopped, which is why monists always say that state should be given absolute power. But the point is how to stop the abuse or arbitrary nature of power. That is the fundamental change. So even the pluralists are also criticized because they also have certain ambivalence. First of all, they don't abolish the state, they simply say reduce the power of state. But if you reduce the power of state, how will you ensure in times of crisis the state is still a relevant entity? And if you allow that power in times of crisis, what is the guarantee that state would not again take that power in normal times also? So practically and functionally, it is very difficult to implement, right? Even though we say, yes, there is a rise of supranational states, but in their own domain, state is supreme, right? Second, you and I are also aware about limitations of international law. Again, go back to Hobbes. He said that laws, basically covenants without swords, are nothing but words. Which means international law does not have the power of enforcement and backing, which is why howsoever strict and howsoever precise the international law be, it will never be implemented in reality. That is the challenge of international law, right? So too much of focus on international law is also not the solution. This also we again saw in COVID-19. When everybody was praising that state should be minimal, etc., ultimately people fell back to the state and the role of state became even more important. Fine. So let us write all of this in one. Okay, so write. Pluralism is praised for being realistic in an age of federalism. Pluralism is praised for being realistic in an age of federalism, global institutions and international law. So in an age of federalism, global institutions and international law, for full stop, right? However, it faces criticism. For internal inconsistency. Inconsistency. Put a dash, right? Pluralists oppose monism but do not abolish the state. Pluralists oppose monism, but do not abolish the state. But do not abolish the state, full stop, right? Elitist scholars, now these scholars we've done in power, right? Elitist scholars like Mosca and Pareto argue, Mosca and Pareto argue that pluralism overlooks the rule of elites. The pluralism overlooks the rule of elites behind democratic structures, full stop. Then right, full stop, right? Contemporary thinkers like Acemoglu and Robinson. Achha, by the way, both these thinkers had also written a very famous book known as Why Nations Fail. I often keep on quoting that book. And these two combined have also got the Nobel Prize for Economics, okay, very recently. So, inke naam ke, in the margins, right, Nobel Peace for Peace, no, not peace, but Nobel Prize for Economics. And just read about their work. Just write in through 2 or 3 lines. That's it. Right? Contemporary thinkers like Acemoglu and Robinson recommended a balanced model called shackled Leviathan. In which state power and societal power keep each other in check. In which state power and societal power keep each other in check. Full stop, right? Thus, while monistic sovereignty provides legal clarity, right? While monistic sovereignty provides legal clarity, comma, pluralistic sovereignty offers a more accurate societal, yes, sociological understanding. Full stop, right? Modern political life requires a synthesis. Modern political life requires a synthesis of both approaches. Modern political life requires a synthesis of both approaches. Okay, now one last line I'll also say. For pluralists, sometimes there's a famous line that goes around, say that they want to have the cake and eat it too. Okay, so either there can be only two things. Either you can eat the cake or you can have the cake. Okay, so you cannot do both. So here the main argument in this particular line is that they expect the state to have lesser powers, but yet the state to also ensure stability. That is again a point I've told you, that there is an internal inconsistency in their idea, in the pluralists, right? So just write this one line extra, although it is already covered in our write-up and in our explanation also, but you write it, right? It is said pluralists, it is said that pluralist wants to keep the cake, they want to keep the cake and have it too. Keep the cake and have it too. And a similar argument we'll also make when we do feminist theory of state, right? So there is lesser clarity. See, remember, the pluralists are not anarchists. Anarchists say we don't need a state. What they say that we need a state, but state should have lesser powers. But if there are lesser powers, how will the state ensure stability? That remains mainly the fundamental conflict within pluralist theory. That even if you reduce the powers of state, in the modern sense of global financial crisis, of COVID-19, of in all these areas, you still want states to have a state to be supreme in overall affairs. That is the challenge which they face, which is why it is said they want to have the cake and also eat it too, or let's say eat the cake and have it, something of that sort. All right. So this brings us to the end of this particular lecture. We have seen state and its elaboration in good detail. Okay. In the next part, now I'll come to these sections: liberal, neoliberal, and here also pluralist. Now we have done, and here only thing that you have not done till now is post-colonial. So I'll emphasize more here. The understanding of all this you already know. So directly, what is the liberal theory of state? I will expand on that. Similarly, for all these issues, we'll do this in more detail because this you've not done yet. Feminist, also feminism you've already done. The only thing remaining is feminist theory of state. Fine. So this we will do in the next lecture. Okay. I'll meet you then. Thank you.